Father President Hines, Chairman Reddy, Dr. Oni Bainey, Reverend Mara Siena, to the faculty, students, and friends at Siena College, I must say that I am deeply moved by this expression of your confidence and your support, and most important, your love. I deeply appreciate your conferring upon me this honorary degree, and I'm deeply honored and privileged to be here with you today. I want to thank the Siena College and the Reinhold Niebuhr Institute of Religion and Culture for inviting me to be here with you in commemoration of your Peace and Justice Week. My gratitude also goes to the more than 24 organizations which are sponsoring this lecture series and who have made my visit here today to Albany, New York possible. It's good to be here in the state of New York and in the seat of government for this great state. One of our dear friends, Mr. Virgil Hodges, who is here today, happens to be a part of the state administration and the Department of Labor, and is also a trustee of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. There are so many associations that I have anytime I am in a university situation, but also especially when that university, college, happens to be of Catholic origin. My husband often talked about the kind of support that he received from the Catholic community during the 60s, and particularly after Pope John the 23rd. I can say that he is my favorite pope, although I admire very deeply the present pope. But I think that Pope John the 23rd was certainly a favorite of a lot of people who happen not to be Catholic, but who have deep respect and appreciation for the great. I would like to say that St. Francis is my favorite saint. So I happen to be in a situation today where I feel quite at home. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man that people often thought didn't have much humor, but he had a great sense of humor. And I remember after he met Pope Paul VI, had an audience with him, and he came back to this country, and during one of his speeches, I happened to be in the audience, and he said, you know, the other day I was in Rome and I had an audience with the Pope. He said, you know, I think we've come a long way when a Pope will agree to see a fellow by the name of Martin Luther. In the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, we have a number of very special staff people who happen to be Catholic. And one of those, those persons has served as the director of the center and is now the vice president for government and international affairs, Lloyd Davis. And the reason I mention that, I want you to know that we are ecumenical. Our Scholars Internship Program, which is a very important program at the King Center for college and graduate students, where they come and study the theory and practice of nonviolent social change and the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. for a quarter or a semester, was initiated at the King Center by a woman, a Catholic woman from the South, Sister Ann Brotherton. And she remained with us for about 4 years, a very, very special human being. And I could mention many others, my administrative assistant, to say the least. So you see, we have very close associations, those of you who happen to be of the Catholic faith in this audience. And after all, we are brothers and sisters, all of us, in Christ Jesus. In January 1986, we celebrated America's first national holiday in honor of a Black American, Martin Luther King Jr., but it was in truth a celebration of the causes for which he lived and died. Love, justice, peace, reconciliation, forgiveness. It was a remarkable nationwide celebration, and millions of Americans took part in a great variety of activities throughout this country. Oh, there were the ecumenical services, the symposia and conferences, the mass marches and rallies, and many other activities for the school system and with young people. But in New York and Washington, D.C., and San Francisco and Atlanta, I know that there were large mass marches, and the largest was in Atlanta, which culminated our 10-day activity. And the march had more than 500,000 people participating in the streets of Atlanta, down Peachtree Street to the Freedom Hall complex of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change. Among that march was Bishop Desmond Tutu and his family. And marching in solidarity with Bishop Tutu and the others who were there had a very special meaning, as he was a guest of our conference, international conference against apartheid. And I'll say more about that later. In addition to all of the activities that took place in our nation, we have been told by the State Department, primarily the USIA, that more than 100 nations throughout the world commemorated activities on the first holiday in memory of Martin Luther King Jr. and in the honor of the contributions of millions of Americans who have struggled across the years for a more just, democratic, and peaceful world. To fully appreciate the importance of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and work, we have only to consider that in the 12 years and 4 months of his leadership of the nonviolent movement, Black Americans achieved more genuine freedom than the previous 4 centuries had produced. Certainly, this fact underscores the greatness of his leadership. However, he would want us to appreciate the larger point about the civil rights movement, and that point is the strength of the revolutionary power of nonviolence. Nonviolence is active non-cooperation with evil. It is active resistance to all forms of injustice, which is distinguished by a firm commitment to refuse to use violence. It is a willingness to suffer for a just cause, but never to inflict suffering. Andy Young has said that nonviolence is organized, aggressive goodwill. I think that is a very excellent way of stating it. When nonviolence is undergirded with a firm foundation of training and discipline, it is the most powerful tool for social change, the most powerful ever devised. And notice I said when it is undergirded with a firm foundation of training and discipline. This is the most important lesson we can draw from the life and work of Martin Luther King Jr. From his study of history, he believed that violence always sows the seeds of bitterness, resentment, and ultimately more violence. He saw that retaliatory violence was a vicious cycle that carried with it the certainty of increased violence. He reasoned that the only way to break the cycle of violence was for someone to refuse to retaliate. He read of the historic nonviolent movement for independence led by Gandhi in India, and also visited the land of Gandhi in 1959. I had the privilege of accompanying him on that visit, and he called it a pilgrimage. Other countries I go to as a tourist, but to India I come as a pilgrim. He fused the strategies of nonviolence with the unconditional love, truth, and forgiveness, even for one's adversaries, that he embraced in his religious training. Man must evolve for all human conflict a method that rejects revenge, aggression, and retaliation, Martin said. The foundation of such a method is love. To accept and practice nonviolence, you must believe that every person has what Martin Luther King Jr. called a spark of divine, which means all of us are made in the image of God. This is a revolutionary concept because it provides us with a rationale for loving our enemies. Let us not forget our responsibility to love our enemies. Perhaps very few people in history really have understood what that means in terms of loving your enemy in the unconditional sense. Let us remember that the end goal of all struggle is reconciliation. Without reconciliation, there will always be enemies. Without reconciliation, there can be no lasting victory and no enduring peace. Only reconciliation can achieve the creation of the beloved community. Only reconciliation can bring brotherhood and goodwill to broken relationships. The key to reconciliation is unconditional love and forgiveness. Martin Luther King Jr. said that only the victim of an injustice can pour out the warm waters of forgiveness, which are so desperately needed for the healing process. It is important to remember, however, nonviolence is active, not passive. It does not avoid conflict, but with an uncompromising love and respect for the adversary's personhood, you oppose his behavior. In a sermon entitled "Loving Your Enemies," my husband put it this way. He said, "Love is the only force capable of transforming an enemy into a friend. We never get rid of the enemy by meeting hate with hate. We get rid of an enemy by getting rid of enmity. Love transforms with redemptive power." End of quote. Let us review the remarkable accomplishments of nonviolence. That is, in America during particularly the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr. and, of course, nonviolence desegregated public facilities and educational institutions in America. Legally, that is a fact. But in reality, we still have much segregation in our school system, some by choice and some otherwise. Nonviolence brought free elections to millions of Americans for the first time. Until the Civil Rights Movement, democracy was just another broken promise to Black Americans. Nonviolence enforced the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. When the movement began in 1955, there were less than 50 Black elected officials, and today there are more than 6,000. Thanks to the Voting Rights Act, which was a direct consequence of the nonviolent campaign led in the South by Martin Luther King Jr., and that campaign was the march from Selma to Montgomery. Of course, that was only a part of the campaign because much pre-planning had been done prior to that march, which is always important to understand about a nonviolent thrust. Preparation and pre-planning are very necessary. In a very real sense, nonviolence gave us the Congressional Black Caucus. And may I say, I think that the Congressional Black Caucus is a very strong force in our Congress and has become, in a sense, a conscience in the Congress. That, too, is very important, particularly at this time in our history. And certainly without nonviolence, that group of men and women would never have been elected to represent a very important segment of our national community. Nonviolence gave Black Americans dignity. It showed us how to resist racism and brutality without compromising our religious principles. From the depths of degradation, nonviolence raised us to the bright, glittering promise of freedom and justice. Nonviolence also freed white Americans. Perhaps it's debatable, but I have heard on several occasions by people from public platforms who said nonviolence freed more white people than it did black people. It freed white people from the moral burden of segregation and the false sense of superiority it entailed. Nonviolence gave us the women's rights movement, the Hispanic, environmental, and other human rights movements, which have emerged in recent years, all of which owe a profound debt of gratitude to nonviolent tactics and strategy of the civil rights movement. Nonviolence gave us Mahatma Gandhi, Martin King Jr., Bishop Tutu, Corazon Aquino, and a long list of role models for young people. Nonviolence brought economic progress to America by integrating the labor force and the market. Nonviolence changed and economically depressed Dixie into the booming Sun Belt. Sometimes I think that fact is not understood, and perhaps it needs to be said more than it is. I remember when we returned south in the 60s, when we went to Atlanta, the South was still a segregated South, and Atlanta was a very segregated city. And Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, you know, the South is such a beautiful place. If somehow we could remove this barrier of segregation. And he knew that the day would come, and he inspired others to believe that it could happen, so that it did happen. Businesses do not want to locate in areas where there is conflict, and they will not. And certainly, if it had not been for the nonviolent revolution in the South, there would have been a violent revolution, and that would have never achieved the kind of progress and prosperity that now exists for so many in that region, still has a distance to go. But it's important to recognize that real progress has been made. I believe a nonviolent revolution can make the difference in our prospects for survival on this planet. Your personal commitment to serve and to become involved in nonviolence can help determine the future of our nation and world. Active nonviolence can be applied to solve every major conflict facing humanity today. Most recently, we have seen the power of nonviolence bring down a brutal, repressive dictatorship in the Philippines. I believe the same nonviolent strategy can be used to bring democracy and human rights to South Africa, Hawaii, and even the Soviet Union. The specific tactics may vary from nation to nation, but the overall strategy of nonviolence, particularly when its practitioners have been properly trained, is the most powerful force available to human rights, peace, and liberation movements around the world. Nowhere is this more clear than in South Africa. Granted, the situation in South Africa needs a lot of help from the outside nations, but with growing and understandable frustration, the black majority in South Africa is preparing to destroy apartheid, whatever the cost. The struggle is escalating, and so is the violence. Time is running out with it. Our hopes for a nonviolent solution must continue to be strong. And thank God for the voice of Bishop Tutu, who took that position and has been steadfast. Let us pray that he will continue to be steadfast in his commitment. But we also must do some work. We must make sure that those who hold power in this and other nations understand that there is a movement against apartheid that cannot be repelled. There is a movement against apartheid that can no longer abide feeble excuses and rationalizations. As surely as Martin Luther King Jr. spoke in Montgomery, as inevitably as he bore witness in Birmingham, as forcefully as he marched from Selma, Montgomery, there is a movement against apartheid, and we are in it to stay. I hope all of the students, faculty, and administration of Siena College will rise up in nonviolent solidarity with their courageous brothers and sisters, Berkeley and Columbia campuses, and all across this nation until apartheid is finally, irrevocably eradicated. I hope all of you will become involved in anti-apartheid divestment and divestiture campaigns. Not just on the campus, but in your community and places of employment as well. As we carry forward the Free South Africa movement and other struggles, we must keep a commitment to nonviolence. At the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change in Atlanta, which is the official living memorial to the life and contributions of Martin Luther King Jr., where we are institutionalizing his philosophy and strategy of nonviolence into ongoing programs. Nonviolence can be demonstrated as being applicable to current social, political, and economic problems. We are deeply involved in education and training in nonviolence. And the King Center, as we call it in shorthand, is providing systematic education and training in nonviolence for community leaders, teachers, students, prison administrators and employees, labor and business leaders, for single parents and preschool children. We also have a fully accredited program for graduate and undergraduate students, which I mentioned earlier. And during the last week of July, we have our annual nonviolent workshop on nonviolence, which is open to all people who want to learn more about nonviolence and especially about Kingian nonviolence, about the King movement and the nonviolence of Martin Luther King Jr. We invite you to join with us. And finally, I would like to leave with you a challenge that Martin Luther King gave us about 1 year before he was assassinated, exactly 1 year to the day. He delivered a very powerful and far-reaching speech at the Riverside Church in New York City on the question of the Vietnam War, and he called it Beyond Vietnam. The speech drew a lot of criticism because it was his first formal statement against U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Not that he had not spoken out against that evil war, but it was the first major formal statement that he had specifically prepared for the issue. That day at Riverside, he addressed a larger issue about the nation's values and direction, and I will leave with you his words. He said, "I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-centered society. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into the sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal opposition to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and thereby speed up the day when every valley shall be exalted and every mountain and hill shall be made low and the crooked shall be made straight and the rough places plain. A genuine revolution of values means that our loyalties must become ecumenical rather than sectional. Every nation must now develop an overriding loyalty to mankind as a whole in order to preserve the best in their individual societies. The choice is ours, and though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this critical moment of human history. Those words could have been stated today. Martin Luther King's prophetic role is very clear. And that challenge I want to leave with you. This challenge to create a revolution of values is more relevant and urgent today than ever before. I believe ours is a generation which has been chosen to launch this new revolution of values and make us a new world of this old world. My brothers and sisters, the tide is high, the time is now, and the dream Martin Luther King's Junior's revolutionary dream is in your hands. It is in our hands. What will we do with it? Thank you.
It is now my great pleasure to present to you
Father Hines, members of the Board of Trustees, administration, the faculty, and the student body of Siena College, my fellow clergy, distinguished community representatives, my dear brothers and sisters. I welcome this opportunity to express my personal and public congratulations to Mrs. King on receiving this honorary degree, and especially for gracing this campus and our capital district with her noble presence. I also want to take this opportunity to salute the members of the Board of Trustees, administration, faculty, and student body of Siena College, who by conferring this honorary degree and by your presence here today evidence a strong commitment to the pursuit of peace, racial equality, social justice, and nonviolent change, which have been the ideals that have motivated and sustained Mrs. King and her husband, the martyred prophet, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Certainly, the accomplishments of Mrs. King's husband are well known, and they have earned for him the highest accolade a nation can afford its great leaders, namely, having a national holiday set aside to honor and cherish his memory, and to serve as a vivid reminder of the values, the ideals, and the causes for which he lived and died. It must never be forgotten, however, that our honorary degree recipient today was his trusted partner, confidant, and advisor in all of his endeavors. And she has continued to carry his banner of liberty, justice, freedom, and nonviolent change into today's world. Indeed, in many respects, her task is even more difficult than that of her husband's, because today the external veneer of racism is more subtle and less blatant than it was 25 years ago, and because the social milieu in the 80s is much more closed than it was in the 60s. It seems, in other words, that a kind of quietism has seeped into our nation's psyche, a kind of dissatisfaction with causes and crusades, a distaste for confusion, agitation, and turmoil, and a desire for calm and serenity that frequently manifests itself in the pursuit of personal goals solely to be achieved within the limited world of one's own existence and of one's own narrow concerns. And in the face of this changing milieu, Mrs. King has remained steadfast in pursuing her husband's vision and in seeking to address the new challenges to the civil rights and peace movements as we approach the third millennium. In other words, she has not been content to bask in her husband's reflected glory or to rest upon past laurels, but rather with boundless energy, dogged determination, great courage, and unshakable faith, she has continued to forge ahead, applying her agenda of human rights and human dignity to changing needs and changing demands and changing times, and offering fresh hope, fresh inspiration, fresh ideas, and fresh solutions to the ongoing challenge and the ongoing struggle to bring about racial harmony and social justice. And so, in her own right then, she is one of the great leaders and heroines of our day. And by honoring her today, Siena College honors its own Franciscan nonviolent tradition of Pax and Bonum. And so it is my hope and prayer that all of us today may be inspired by her presence, that all of us today, because of her presence, will be reminded of the bitter legacy of racial discrimination and slavery which continue to plague our nation's landscape, a legacy of unemployment and underemployment, of inferior educational opportunities and structural poverty, and that her presence today will inspire us to follow her dynamic and visionary leadership which will not rest until her husband's noble dream becomes a reality not only for all Americans, but for all the members of the human family with whom we share an unbreakable bond of solidarity. Mrs. King, again, congratulations, and thank you for your vision and spirit and presence which enlivens and inspires us. God bless you always.
I now call upon Dr. Chaim Kival, Director of Siena